We know what we have to do to become a championship team. We're a different team this year. They're a different team right now. They're missing some key guys.
This is a hometown, homecoming event for you.
It was incredible to have all of my friends and family here. We've realized repeating is really hard, and at some point the rest of the league is going to catch up.
Minnesota leads!
That was absolutely nasty from Ben Yacht.
We got to keep it going. Stay aggressive, defensive pressure.
Intercepted! Allen Berry! What a moment here in Minnesota!
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass Week 11 Recap Pod coming at you. I am Adam Ruffner. That is Cameron Brock. We apologize for the sabbatical at the end of last weekend, but with Cameron traveling out to the Mountain West and there being a national holiday here in the U.S., we decided to take one episode off from this season, but we are live and back at you now to recap everything going on within the association. We have 10 playoff teams confirmed throughout the league with 12 available spots. The only division who doesn't have all three teams locked up is the Central Division. We will obviously tap in Cam for his expertise on what is going on in the most chaotic standings within the league this year. But getting back to those 10 clinched playoff teams, Atlanta, Austin, Boston, Carolina, DC, Minnesota, New York, Oakland, Salt Lake, and Seattle have all punched their tickets for the postseason. Of note, I think in the West Division, Seattle and Oakland making their first respective playoff trips since 2016 and 2017. Some longtime returners to the postseason there, but Week 11 was not short on any kind of thrilling action. There were some very upturning results within the Central Division, most notably with Chicago getting a 5-goal win at Minnesota against the reigning division champions. The Union offense performing better than I think they've had in the past two seasons, just looking almost unstoppable against the Minnesota defense, which has been one of the top units in the league over the past several seasons. Elsewhere within the same division, Madison getting a last-second 21-20 win over Pittsburgh. The Radicals improving to 6-4. Meanwhile, Pittsburgh stumbling to 4-6, having dropped each of their last 3 games, falling out of control of their own playoff destiny and sitting within 5th place in the Central Division, looking up at both you guys in Indianapolis and obviously Chicago and Madison. And then, of course, and we'll get to this in a second, AlleyCats stumbling on the road 18-16 against the Colorado Summit. The Summit trying to extend their playoff lives, but due to an Oakland win in the same weekend, as well as a loss in the following day by San Diego, the Colorado Summit are eliminated, as well as the Growlers. Again, that is why Oakland is making their first playoff trip since 2017. Cam, you're coming back from quite an exciting road trip. AlleyCats took an early lead on the road, but y'all couldn't hang on. You now sit at 4-5 in the standings. We'll obviously get to some more in-depth breakdown, but I wanted to get your top-of-mind thoughts about playing in Marquez Stadium within the Rockies. First-time interdivisional matchup. Any extenuating thoughts you had? I know you've got a couple of stories to share, so here's kind of your open forum to just talk about both the game and your experience in Colorado.
Sure. First off, the venue's amazing, as you can tell from streams, and just actually being there, though, it truly is incredible just to like be on the field and like look around. And this is coming from a guy who plays in Indiana, where the tallest piece of land you're going to see anywhere is just like dwarfed in comparison to even the smallest mountain you would see in anywhere in Colorado. So just being in that environment was cool. They had a pretty good crowd. I mean, all the guys on Colorado were super welcoming, super nice too. It's also interesting. I'm in a unique position, being a guy I think that is fairly recognizable across the league and playing against new teams that we don't get to see very often. I get players sometimes from other teams who are excited to talk to me, and if you would have told me in 2012 that any player from any other team would ever be excited to talk to me, I would have thought you were crazy. So Very humbling experience when that happens. But I despite the outcome, which obviously isn't the most fun outcome to go out, travel out there and lose a game. Overall, great experience. Love getting to see teams from the other division. Had some nice banter with Alex Atkins on the field. I know that will shock people that Atkins was trying to talk some trash. Totally out of character for him. Something no one would ever expect. But late in the game, they took an injury, and one of our guys came out for a sub, and I actually went in to play defense on Atkins. And was just like, hey, look at this. It's the old generation versus the new generation. And he said that doesn't usually work out very well for the old generation. I was like, I'm not like those other old guys. So he tried to make a couple cuts and went nowhere, didn't get open. They ended up turning the disc over. So I'm going to say chalk 1 point up for the old generation on that one.
Well, you said I could have some fodder at this individual play,
Yep.
so this is where I'm going to give it to you. You did have
Yep.
that late game hand block by Kai Marshall on you that was a little bit of a momentum shifter, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a second. But
yeah, no, we'll just get into it right now. So you know what?
wait.
We'll end there because that was towards the end of the game.
Hold on 1 second. I wanted to pull back, and we'll get to this later on in the episode too, but I wanted to give a better playoff picture because I feel like that's become really the focus within the league, is that there are now 10 of 12 playoff spots confirmed, as I mentioned at the top of the episode. Every division but the Central has been confirmed as far as the playoff seeds that will be going to the postseason. So in the East, you've got DC, Boston, and New York in that order. First seed still completely up for grabs. In fact, the only division where the first seed is determined is the Central with Minnesota. Aside from that, all the other three divisions still need to have their one seed decided, and will likely have it decided in the 13th and final weekend of the season, coming up just over 10 days from now. Seattle will be playing Salt Lake for the one seed in the West. Atlanta will be playing Carolina in the South for the one seed there. And DC and New York will be determining whether DC or Boston, or by some dark magic, I don't know exactly the scenario that needs to go down for New York to possibly summit the East again. But I feel like that's still in play too. It's just a little bit on my purview at this point. It's just to speak again to this chaos season. I know I keep hammering on that drum, but it is so true. And it's not only because every team within the league now, with Minnesota losing to Chicago in week 11, having 2 losses, it also has to do with the fact that every single team, and especially the contenders, has suffered a kind of loss this season that is disconcerting for their typical play style. And so I just wanted to kind of give a general picture as to where we're at in the league, where we have both a majority share of the playoff teams confirmed, but aside from that, there's no real lucidity to the picture that we're seeing or who we favor as far as a champion. Because I think that this is the first time in as long as I can basically remember that has not been the case, that we don't enter the final 2 weeks of the regular season and have a good idea as to who the favorite is, as well as who's going to be contending that favorite for the title spot. This year, it just feels totally up for grabs. I mean, there's almost 8 teams who I could say, if they get hot at the right time over these next couple of weeks, could maybe summit and put themselves in a favorable position. I mean, again, we'll get into this later. The number 1 seed at championship weekend is entirely up for grabs. And that is such a determining factor as to what kind of matchup you get in the Final Four bracket, as well as how you set up your potential title odds. I just think it's so fascinating to be at this juncture of the season and have no real clue as to what it means to stagger the favorite versus the field. I mean, again, we went into April of this year thinking, oh, you could take New York versus the field and basically everyone would take the Empire. And now we're at this point, 11 weeks into the season where it's, again, totally up for grabs.
Question. You say that it is up for grabs, by the way, like 100%. And I was actually doing some looking through like older seasons. I'm like, how many seasons have we like ended where everyone had at least 2 losses. And because, we've had a number of teams go undefeated. We've had some like 1-loss teams win. But yeah, there's been the last time we had everyone with at least 2 losses was in 2021. Obviously, in 22 and 23, we had some undefeated Empire teams. 2019, we had an undefeated Empire team. We had an undefeated Toronto Rush team at one point. So there's only been like 4. This is only like the 5th season where everyone's had at least 2 losses in the league's history, I believe, 5th or 6th. So about half the time. But it's crazy too, because who knows, by the end of the season, we might be looking at everyone with 3 or more losses. It is just, it's been such a unique season when you look at it, especially compared to the last 2 where New York was just so dominant. And even within each division, it felt like there was a team that was like pretty dominant. And really right now, like you said, the Central is the only place where there's been a team who it has clinched first, but it's hard to say Minnesota's even been dominant in that regard, because they're too, especially their first loss at home to Pittsburgh was confusing. And I think the other thing is the fact that both of their losses are at home is like, if you would have told me they'd been 8-2, I would have believed that. But if you would have told me they would have lost both, like 2 of those would have been home games, that would have been shocking to me.
And we'll get to this later, but also the fact that they gave up 25 goals at home to a Union team that has struggled to put up points over the past season and a half. One of the best defensive teams in Chicago, but scoring is not really their proclivity. And yet they were darn near unstoppable on offense against a Winchell team that was admittedly down Quinn Snyder and Dylan DeClercq on defense, but still had its normal rotation of starting defenders that is usually pretty adept at slowing down opposing offenses. And they just had no purchase. And so kind of connecting to what I was saying a few moments ago, there are just each contender has a loss that isn't just not understandable. It kind of goes against the style that we're used to seeing them succeed at.
Yeah, I think Boston's the only one where I'm like, their 2 losses are 1 to New York and 1 to DC.
And they don't have a playoff win in their franchise history.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. That's true. But like, they don't have I guess they don't have that concerning loss either. Like,
true.
I guess is where I'm getting to.
I mean, Seattle would be the other team in that category, I feel like.
Yep.
Their only multi-goal loss was at Colorado in the second game of the season, coming off of another road game.
And that was probably the best Summit lineup we've seen all year that has not been replicated since, I don't think.
Yeah. But to your point, it's like the most proven teams, I'm using air quotes here because you can't see it, but the most proven teams are the 2 least proven teams, I would say, over the last several seasons in this league. Obviously, Oakland joins that class too, having not participated in the postseason since the beginning of the Trump administration in 2017. So it's like, it's been a while for the teams that seem to be exuding the most confidence and momentum entering the playoffs. And yet all these teams that I think we would more earmark as contenders have losses that are real head scratchers. Again, we'll get to Chicago and Minnesota in a minute. I wanted to allow you to talk about what you were beginning to talk about before in the Colorado at Indy matchup. Again, Summit taking care of business at home, 18-16. At the time of their victory, it kept them alive in the playoffs, but since then they've been eliminated. Colorado won the West Division in 2022. They were in the first round of the playoffs last year, having lost to LA. And since then, it's just been a couple of steps downward for a still very talented Summit team who has had a lot of close battles, but just hasn't been able to really get over the hump. They sit at 5-6 now, playing one more game without any kind of meaning, but they do get this home win against you guys and kind of put the AlleyCats back within a little bit of a disadvantaged position within the Central Division standings. Obviously, the interdivisional loss softens the blow just a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think it's just interesting how much pressure the AlleyCats were able to get, especially at the earlier part of the game, against the Colorado offense. This has been kind of a struggle issue for most of the games for Indy this season, is generating defensive pressure. And yet you guys finished with more blocks. You have 14 in the game. Probably half dozen of those coming within the first quarter and a half of this matchup. Joel Close, Seth Goodman, a number of players really participating for the AlleyCats defense in getting in the way of Colorado passes. And yet, at the end of the day, Indy finishes with just, 3 of 13 on defensive break opportunities, which is just a tough number to swallow given the amount of turnovers that they were able to force out of the Summit.
So if you just watched the game and there was like no scoreboard, right? Like you were just kind of watching and you weren't really necessarily like keeping track of the score in your head, you would have thought we were up 5 or 6 at halftime. I mean, our defense dominated the first half of that game in terms of like making Colorado uncomfortable and generating turnovers. And as that was amazing. But the problem we had was when we got the disc, no one looked like they wanted to play offense. And that was kind of where we struggled in that first half. Like we did such a good job of generating Ds. Like Seth Goodman had 4 Ds in the first quarter. And I think the stats right now say he had 4. I'm pretty sure he had 5 for the game. I think he had another one in the second quarter. Joel Close was flying around the field. I mean, we had 14 blocks in this game. I mean, really, like our D-line, which was much maligned early in the season, like you talked about it, Lepler talked about it, and the Tuesday tosses, like how our defense just wasn't generating any blocks. And really, over the past 3 or 4 games, our D-line's really it found its footing. I mean, we had 17 blocks against Madison last week, 14 blocks against in Colorado this week. They're really finding their footing, and I think that's just having a lot of young guys and new guys to the team, and figuring out the defensive systems and like where to be and what to do, and also just gaining some confidence for these players who are like, many of whom coming into this season had played either no games or at least were under double-digit games. Joel Close has generated some insane blocks for us this year, and he was a guy I think it only got into 3 or 4 games last year. So, kudos to them for that. But we just couldn't find any real purchase with like generating breaks. We had a turnover at the end of the first quarter that allowed Colorado to score right before the end of the first quarter, which instead of going into the second quarter with a 2-goal lead, we go in with a 1-goal lead. We just kind of hold serve in the second quarter. And it really was, the momentum really started to shift at the beginning of the third quarter when Colorado came out and just, after struggling so much the whole first half, comes out, gets a couple of quick scores on some defensive switch issues where Logan Priest gets deep twice, basically unguarded. And from there, our offense, like we just kind of, we didn't fall apart, but we kind of lost a little bit of the footing that we had in the first half. And yeah, like a lot of it comes down to like, if you want to look at a play, like the play your eyes probably go to is my turnover near our own end zone. This is a play we've all seen it happen to someone, and every time I've seen it, I've been like, man, that has to feel terrible. And it is the moment a player goes to pump fake and the disc just slips right out of their hand. And here I was, it happened to me. And I can tell you, it does feel bad. It feels real bad. I can tell you from experience now. Kai Marshall was on me. He stepped out to stop my throw in that lane. So I tried to pump fake the disc, and it just came right out of my hand and right into Kai Marshall. And they picked up the disc essentially on the goal line and scored to go up 2 with. Still definitely enough time for us to like get back in the game. I want to say there were like maybe 4 minutes left in the game at this point, but that was kind of the spot that really kind of put us in a hole where we were going to have to, instead of just us going down and scoring and tying the game and just waiting to hopefully get one break to get out in front. Well, now we have to break just to have a chance to go in and tie. Right. So it just put our team under a lot more pressure. And then we did not close out the game very well after that. We were not very good with the disc for that final 3 minutes on offense. So we didn't really give ourselves a chance for our defense to go out there and do something. So, I'll take a lot of the blame for that. It was, it's a mistake that can happen to anyone, and I get that. And it's obviously nothing I did intentional. I didn't want to make that throw, but it happens. And like the only thing I can do and the only thing we can do as a team at this point is move on. And, just, as you mentioned, interdivisional game. In terms of making the playoffs, it doesn't hurt us. Like winning this game wouldn't have even necessarily helped our cause for making the playoffs. It just would have helped us have an easier road to the 2 seed. Our last 3 divisional games it was like really pretty much going to come down to, we were probably going to need to win our last 3 games anyways. So I guess that's me coping, but
okay.
Yeah.
First off, I know I threw you under the bus a little bit ago earlier in this episode, and obviously it is a crucial point to have a hand block happen and to have the disc slip out of your hands. But like, that wasn't the ultimate cause of the downfall of the AlleyCats on the road.
Sure.
There's plenty
Team
of
loss
statistics here that give that away as well. You have 22 turnovers, your second highest of the entire season, other than that win struck game in Chicago on June 22nd. You guys have generated 44 blocks in your last 3 games, but have only converted on 12 break opportunities, which is just a tough, again, pill to swallow. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned your final 3 games, all road games, at Detroit on July 13th, then at Pittsburgh on Sunday, July 14th, which has most notably been flexed into the game of the week spot, given the fact of the playoff importance and that it's do or die for both you guys in Indianapolis and Pittsburgh. Feels like whichever team loses that matchup will fall entirely out of the playoff picture, while the other one will keep their hopes alive, if a little bit on life support. And then your final game in the final weekend of the regular season here in Madison. I'm excited to see you, man. On July 19th, as you visit Madison Radicals in what will also ostensibly be for a potential playoff spot, depending on if Madison can win against Chicago this coming Friday at home as they get set to host the Union, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I just kind of wanted to talk for a second about the AlleyCats, where you guys are at 4 and 5. You're a little bit behind the 8 ball, but I still feel like you say, you have enough games and you have enough ramp where there is kind of a momentum you can build into in the final part of your schedule.
Yeah, and we do control our own playoff destiny. We win our 3 games, we're in the playoffs. There's no help needed from anyone else. And we're even still, believe it or not, in play for the 2 seed, which is hilarious to me. But we're still like, I'm still okay with where we're at. We'd obviously love to have either the playoffs locked up or at least, a little less pressure going into these last 3 games. But honestly, it's like that pressure can also help us. I mean, we're essentially in playoff mode right now. We have to keep winning to keep playing. And while that can be a little daunting, I think it can also be a strengthening tool for us as well, because if we are able to win these 3 games and go to the playoffs, when we go into that first playoff game, it's really not any more pressure than we'll have faced for the last 3 games. And I think especially for younger guys who maybe haven't played in a playoff game before, like kind of having this almost playoff like weight on us can be something that can kind of help us if we are able to win our last 3 games and make the playoffs. I love that our defense is starting to generate more, like just so much more pressure and get some blocks, and that it's not even just coming from one person. I mean, Seth Gudeman had an amazing game and was just kind of all over the place. But, when you get 17 blocks in a game, when you get 14 blocks in a game, like obviously that's not just coming from 1 or 2 guys. That's team-wide defense and a lot of people getting involved. So, I have faith in them that our D-lines, that they'll start to figure out how to convert, because I think early in the season, they just didn't have a lot of opportunities to try to convert breaks, right? We weren't forcing a lot of turnovers. So, they'll find their footing. I have faith in them. And, the fact that we still control our own playoff destiny is really nice because, like you said, funny enough, like Pittsburgh has very little control over their playoff destiny, and I'm sure that they would, rather be in our shoes where they get to control things. And it's a kind of a place of privilege, like to be this far into a season and be able to control your destiny still is, it's something a lot of teams obviously can't say. So we have to, take advantage of it while it's in front of us.
And I'm sure we'll get more into the autopsy about Colorado a little bit later on in a different podcast entirely. But I wanted to speak a second for them getting the win in this game and yet still being eliminated for the first time in their franchise's history. Granted, the Summit came into existence in 2022, but I think it's no stretch of the imagination to say that this team has been a championship contender since they came into the association. And so for them to be out of the playoff picture entirely with still 2 regular season weekends remaining, again, they've been chosen as a Super Series team because of the expectation levels of where their talent could take them. And they're now entirely out of the playoff picture. Alex Atkins has an incredible game in this. He tosses that absolutely momentum shifting, almost full field score to Atkin Arnstein in the waning moments of the fourth quarter to really clinch the Colorado win. He finished his 60-60 from the field in his Week 11 game against Indy, and is just kind of emblematic of Summit may get down at times, and obviously they are eliminated from postseason contention, but this feels like a little bit of a learning lesson that Colorado needed to learn, was that they have the talent to compete in any given matchup and kind of overcome whatever sort of 8-ball they place themselves behind. But by the same token, they're one of the hardest fighting teams. I mean, you flip a couple of their 2-3 goal losses the opposite way, and they're suddenly, a 7-2, 8-2 team at this point in the season. And so I just think it bears out mentioning that Colorado fought valiantly kind of down to the last man and are unfortunately eliminated from the playoff contention this year. But it's such a interesting data point in the rest of the season that we keep labeling as being complete chaos, that a team like Colorado can be out of the playoff picture, and just the tumult of the West Division in general. But we'll, again, get more into that, I'm sure, at a later point. I wanted to more focusedly shift to another Central Division matchup, the game of the week from Week 11, Chicago at Minnesota. Minnesota coming into this matchup having claimed the first 2 meetings against the Union, both in Chicago. Most notably, I think, the weekend prior, winning by 1 goal with a Noah Hansen block in the waning moments to seal the win-chill victory. But the Union going to Seaphone Stadium this past Saturday and getting a wire-to-wire win against the Windchill. And as I mentioned at the top of this episode, doing so with their offense, allowing the Windchill to their fewest takeaway total of the year. The Union, conversely, having their most impressive offensive performance of the season, yes, including even over their victories against Detroit. They also have their second fewest turnovers of the season, but notably, they had their fewest against the AlleyCats indoors at Grand Park. This 11 turnover performance at Seaphone, which is notoriously an environment that produces a lot of mistakes for opponents. The Union looked absolutely flawless at times. Hats off to Sam Kaminsky, Jack Shanahan, Dex Draymond, and the rest of that offense for having just a fantastic performance on the road. They improved to 6-4. And I think most notably just kind of raised the stock of where we think of this Chicago team as being at. They get a win now on the road at Minnesota. It couples with their win against Austin, who also clinched their playoff seeding this past weekend. So they have these 2 real vital home wins against potential playoff foes. They go on the road this Friday at Madison, could pick up another one and really settle themselves as the second best team in the Central Division. I know you have a lot of thoughts about the Union. You've been playing them throughout your entire career. So what do you see from them as they get this, again, very impressive, very distinct 5-goal win on the road against the reigning division champions?
It's really interesting because, who does this tell me more about? this win, right? Like, does it tell me more about like Chicago's offense finally kind of finding their footing, something they haven't had since 2022? When when the roster was unrecognizable from what it is now, right? There's very few players on this team that were in Chicago in 2022. Or is this maybe a warning sign for Minnesota? Minnesota didn't generate their first block in this game. This is a team that across the league, right? They average the third most blocks per game. And if we're being completely honest, probably the only reason the Radicals are ahead of them is because they have an extra game against Detroit where they've had quite a few. I mean,
perennially a top 3 team in takeaways are the Windchill.
They average almost 12 a game. They didn't have their first block in this game until 4 minutes left in the second quarter.
It reminds me
I know
so
they didn't
much,
have.
You know what it reminds me of? New York at Atlanta earlier this year, where it took until late in the second half for the umpire to generate a turnover. I mean, Windchill just looked a step or 3 behind the Union the entire game.
So like it was like really, when something really weird like that happens, like this is the complete inverse of what you would think going into this game, right? Like Chicago always plays Minnesota tough in Minnesota. Even last year when they were having kind of a down year, they went into Minnesota and won a game. And so, but I don't know what it tells me more about, because does it tell me that Chicago's offense is figuring it out, or is this like a warning sign for Minnesota's defense that maybe something's happening? They were only missing Dylan DeClerc, and he's really good. And I get that, you can take a player off and it is going to affect the defense, but like they've played games without him before this season, and it has never looked like this. Like they were still able to generate pressure, generate blocks. And so this, Chicago is a team that struggled with turnovers all season. You mentioned outside of their indoor game against us, also at a point in the season where our defense, as I mentioned before, wasn't really generating blocks no matter where we were playing at that point. So it's so crazy to me. Like, I never in my wildest dreams would have thought Chicago would have come out of this game with only 11 turnovers. 11 is that's a good number for anybody playing anywhere against any team, let alone playing in Seafoam Stadium where Minnesota is so good. And Minnesota's defense is obviously, as you mentioned, perennial, like a top 3 blocks per game team in the league. So first off, 100% kudos, respect to Chicago for like playing such a great game. Like I watched as much of this as I could before I had to start warming up for my game. And, it was just like crazy to me how efficient they were being and how safe they were playing with the disc. It just seemed like every pass was just so easily completed. There wasn't, and to your point, it looked like Minnesota's defenders were a step or more behind every pass down the field. And I'm not sure what to credit that to. Minnesota's not really playing for anything outside of potential championship weekend seeding at this point, should they make it there. I want to say that didn't play into this, but it's just, it looked like such a lackluster effort from a Minnesota team that I would never say that about in any other circumstances.
So let's walk through the Union's offensive performance. They convert on nearly 70% of their offensive possessions, season high. They only turn the disc over 11 times as a team. They are 18 of 21 within the red zone against the Windchill, which really speaks to how well they were able to move the disc, right? Like to get that often within the red zone and get that many short range opportunities. We've talked about again and again this season is such a pivotal part of the success within the UFA in the modern scope of the league. And then again, to something that we've hit on consistently on this show, they take a double-digit amount of huck attempts, but they complete 8 of 11, 73%. They're very clean on those deep attempts. I think a Dremen completing 4 on his own. I think he was 4 of 6. But in general, Chicago just balanced their attack so well. You have this ability to strike deep with the kind of throwers that they have. Kaminsky also had a fantastic huck look at some point in this game. But then, by and large, they're working it through the interstitial spaces and kind of relying a little bit more on small ball. You know, we've seen Wilson Matthews and Andrew Sjogren obviously emerge as A1 scoring talents and kind of true receiving targets, but everyone was participating in this Union offensive win. And it was just such a distinct moment from kind of where they've been again over the last season plus, as you mentioned, since 2022, where it's kind of always been shifting lineups, not knowing exactly what to expect from any given player in a given matchup. And yet in this one, when they have Weiss and Lithgow and Shanahan all available, that height and that ability to kind of strike from wherever on the field, but stay within their comfort pocket of knowing that they can just play pitch and catch. Like this, I to your point about which team this showed more about, I hear what you're saying about sort of Minnesota's inability to generate defensive pressure. But to me, it more so showed that Chicago has this ceiling offensively when they get all their starters that can be challenging for any defensive matchup in the Central Division.
Yeah, I mean, that honestly, we were here in Indy kind of confused for a lot of the season on why they weren't being more successful on offense. I actually thought after they came to Indy and I get like it's indoors, whatever, but like teams come indoors against us and turn it over 15 plus times all the time. Like this isn't like, it's not like you just come indoors and magically your offense is fixed. If it's bad outdoors, it's probably not going to be very good indoors either. But like, I thought maybe this is the game. Maybe this is the game that like jumpstarts them and they're going to kind of figure things out offensively. And it wasn't. And they kind of went back to struggling. And but maybe this is. Maybe this is like, maybe this is who they are now. Maybe this is just their ceiling and they just got to find ways to consistently get there. I do think Dex Draymond's been so good for them this year. Even in some games, like in our game in Indy, like they lost, but he was, shooting all over the field. I mean, he was keeping it in it with his throws. I don't know if this is how they start playing from this point forward. I mean, that's scary because the defense, as you mentioned, has already been there. Like the D-line generates turnovers, pretty good about converting breaks when they get it. If this is them finally like figuring it out and putting the offense together, and I mean that's scary not just for the division, but that's like scary moving into like a potential championship weekend for them because they could really do some things. And I'm actually excited because we kind of might get sort of an answer to this question next week. Like, is this just their offense taking a big step forward that they're going to continue to do because they have a matchup in Madison next week. So another team fighting for a playoff spot, they get to and going into a hostile environment where, there's going to be a ton of fan presence. And, if they can go and repeat this performance, do something similar next week, I think that'll kind of answer that question for us. Like, is this just who they are now? Like, have they kind of figured things out?
I'm really privileged to be able to call that matchup between Madison and Chicago this coming Friday on Watch UFA TV. You're definitely going to want to tune in for that game. I wanted to move on now to the Radicals' own win at home in Week 11 against Pittsburgh. The Thunderbirds were missing multiple starters, but again, it almost felt like addition by subtraction for this Pittsburgh team. They simply, when they reduce the amount of variables or things that they have to think about, I don't know what it is, but the Thunderbirds played basically to their optimum potential on the road. They ended up losing in the waning moments of the fourth quarter, 21-20 against the Radicals. Madison really surging off of some big plays and some crowd element. It has started to feel in the capital city of Ultimate like the Breeze Stevens aura is slowly coming back for this Radicals team. But to your point a moment ago, I think it will be tested most mightily this Friday against Chicago because while their wins against Colorado and the Thunderbirds have been impressive, they've been against lesser versions of either of those teams. And the Union figured to be bringing virtually a full-strength roster on the road for this matchup that will basically determine who gets a home field playoff game in the first round of the Central Division playoffs and who will have to go on the road or possibly get into an elimination territory. And so I just wanted to talk briefly about Radicals versus Thunderbirds. Again, Radicals improving to 6-4, Thunderbirds falling to 4-6. That loss that allowed Detroit to break their professional sports defining losing streak has really set the Thunderbirds back, as these last two losses to the Flyers and Radicals have been understandable, coupled with the loss to the Mechanix, have put the Thunderbirds on the brink of elimination. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, you will be facing off against them this coming Sunday in Pittsburgh in a second meeting between your two teams in the game of the week that will decide who will remain playoff viable and who will be on the outskirts of the Central Division playoff race. But in this game, I just wanted to talk about where the Radicals are at, because I think they're a really interesting team in the same regard as Chicago. They haven't quite found back-to-back performances that prove their standing as a kind of contender within the Central Division against Minnesota. And yet at the same time, they've shown enough to, I think, challenge the idea that Minnesota can just run away. Again, the Central is the only division where all three playoff seeds have not been determined. The Winchell are the only team with a playoff spot clinched. And given their loss to Chicago, there's just a lot of questions about how this whole rock, paper, scissor ordering has gone throughout the entire division all 2024 season long.
Yeah, I don't know, man. Just like throw rock and hope you win. So Pittsburgh, I mean, I'll just come out and say it. Pittsburgh has been, when Max Shepard's not on the field, they play like a completely different style on offense, and it feels like everyone gets more involved. And like, I don't have a stat for that, right? Like, I'd have to like go down and break down into like the minutia to like try to find any semblance of like, is this a real thing? But I don't know. It's weird. When he's not there, they seem to be more competitive, which makes no sense because Max Shepard, man, that dude is good. Like, I've been watching that dude just dominate defenders for years, whether it be players on my team or players on other teams. But whatever it is, like, you know, Tristan Yarder being added to the lineup, he had a pretty good game. Like, he seems to be definitely a difference maker for them. And, you know, gets the disc in his hands a lot. I think Will Hoffenkamp has been playing pretty well for them too. Like, you know, these are guys that aren't like longtime Thunderbirds, right? They don't have like these illustrious UFA careers for us to go look at, but I think they've been doing a pretty good job. McGonigal's been scoring goals left and right for them. I know he scored quite a few against us in our loss to them earlier this season. He had 6 goals in this game. Just, you know, wear number 3 in profit, right? Like I always say. But yeah, I don't know, this Pittsburgh team. Like, I can never put my finger on the Madison. You know, held strong and like only had 11 turnovers on the game. Like, it was a really low turnover game, only 24 combined between the two teams. Like, it was a pretty clean game. But it's just dumbfounding to me. The Pittsburgh Thunderbirds are the most I don't know what you're going to get team in the league. You know, the first half against Carolina last week, they went into halftime down 1. You know, they were right there. And here in this game, like, again, on the road against a team that just came into Pittsburgh and just wrecked shop on them earlier this season, they go up to Madison and they, you know, have a lead after the first quarter. They're tied going into the last quarter. They only lose by a point. They're so Jekyll and Hyde. I know for this weekend, I'm just assuming we are getting the absolute best version of them. I'm going out there thinking we got to play like the cleanest, you know, offensive game of the season, and that they're going to be, you know, really stingy with throwaways, because I think that's how you need to approach teams. You need to approach them as if they're going to be playing their best. But it is just wild how varying their results are.
And on the flip side, you have this Radicals team that is at 6-4, but there's a little bit of, I think, a falseness to some of the numbers that you see with them. You know, one of the things that I've been meaning to bring up on the show is something that I heard in a DC Breeze broadcast a week ago, which was them commenting on head coach Lauren Boyle saying, you know, the numbers don't always tell you everything, excuse me. And I think of that with this Radicals team because they're second in the league in break rate. They're second in the league in breaks per game. They're first in blocks per game. They kind of have these runs and highlight plays, most pronouncedly punctuated by Anthony Gutowski, who's currently the league leader in goals, where they look imposing. And yet, if you just kind of rub your eyes a little bit and take a half step back, they barely escaped at home against a Pittsburgh team that, again, was missing double digits amount of starters, particularly, I think, noticeably on defense, where Pittsburgh only generated, 5 blocks, I think, in this game? Yep, 5 blocks. Madison had 11 total turnovers, but Pittsburgh affected less than half of those. You know, there are some smoke and mirrors here to which the Thunderbirds were allowed to stay close, and I feel like that's emblematic of where the Radicals are, which is that they have these really impressive abilities to transition on defense and take advantage and become this really imposing, break-heavy team that they've been historically in the past that has led to so much success for them and 6 straight championship appearances between 2013 and 2018. And yet, there's also the bit that has kept them out of the postseason since that championship run in 2018, which is that there's unforced errors. There's kind of a tightness that comes up for this team in critical moments. And I think that it's great that they've been able to persevere against Colorado and Pittsburgh at home. But, you know, it was only a week prior that they had a fumble on the road against you guys in a tight matchup. And so the Radicals are just one of those teams, along with what we've been talking about with this whole season, where they have such interesting highs, but there's enough low points where I do have a lot of questions about them. Again, they sit in third place currently, despite being in a virtual tie with Chicago, but owing that they have a head-to-head loss, they face a virtual must-win at home this coming Friday against a Union team that's coming off their most impressive win in the past 2 seasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I won't go through all the playoff scenarios right now because there's just no point. We'll have a much clearer picture after next weekend of what needs to happen for each team. But yeah, Madison, it's funny, even though they currently sit with a better record than us, like if they lose to Chicago this weekend, it puts them in a really weird place. And you know, the funny thing is, obviously, no one is safe, right? No one's clinched a spot yet, but their situation seems rather precarious. They did play tight with Chicago in Chicago. I think they only lost that game by a goal or two. So, I mean, they're definitely capable of hanging with and beating Chicago, especially, I think, you know, given that they don't have to be the ones traveling. But yeah, it's really strange. You know, they haven't fared very well against non-Detroit, non-Pittsburgh teams, right? 5 of their 6 wins are against Detroit and Pittsburgh. Their other one coming against Colorado, you know, making their long road trip into Madison, which was a game that they almost gave away. So yeah, I don't know. Madison, I think they clearly have the talent to like win some of these games. They've been up in late in some of these games that they've lost, but they're going to have to find a way to hold on, and like beating Chicago next week would be a huge step in the right direction for them, obviously, of making the playoffs. So I think for them, you know, it would prove something to the rest of the league, I think, but it also would go a long way in strengthening their playoff hopes. So, I mean, they just got to keep their eyes on one game at a time at this point, because again, they do control their own playoff destiny, but it happens by winning both of their games. Otherwise, they're gonna need some help.
Couple other Week 11 headlines I wanted to get to. I think most notably the 2 teams that punched their playoff tickets in Austin and Oakland. Seoul making their third straight playoff appearance with their win over Houston by a 10-goal margin, 28-18 over their interstate rivals. The Havoc were playoff viable after winning by 1 on Friday against Dallas, but just could not keep an edge against the Seoul. The final score is a bit deceiving. Houston did stay close in this game through the first 2 quarters. They've done this before against Austin, where the first half, they really stay in contention, and then they just cannot sustain it over the full 4. They fall on the road once again to Austin, having never beaten their superiors in the state capital. So again, the Seoul punching their 3rd playoff ticket to the South Division bracket. And then Oakland, they get a big 26-17 win over the Nitro, but they had to wait until Sunday with the Aviators winning in the final moments 25-24 over their SoCal rivals from San Diego. And then I wanted to touch for a second on the most thrilling game of the weekend, the only overtime game we've had in the past several, with Boston getting a 21-20 win at Montreal. It looked like the Royale, much like they were going to do against DC a couple weekends ago, we're going to close out a big home game win against a potential championship contender. And yet, even with a 1-goal lead and the disc in overtime with less than 2 minutes remaining, the Royale could not hold on. They turf a couple of open side possessions. Boston takes advantage, and the Glory improved to 8-2. Meanwhile, the Royale fall to 2-8.
So this was a 1 p.m. game, and we were out in Colorado, so this was an 11 a.m. game for our viewing pleasure. So we actually watched this together as a team in the hotel lobby, basically, start to finish. And I think Montreal is just going through kind of some natural growing pains, right? Like, they won 0 games last year. Like, that's something, as well as they've played against so much of the East this year, especially the top 3 teams in the East, the playoff teams, we do have to remember that they're coming from a winless season. And this is, I think, much like the DC game, which they also had in hand and lost, and much like some of their close games they've had with some of the other teams throughout. This is them needing to learn to walk before they can run. I've played every season in this league, and I've gone from, first 3 years making playoffs to then next 3 years missing the playoffs, right? To then back in the playoffs, then to championship weekend, and then playing for a team who only beat Detroit. Like, I've gone through the highs and lows and the roster shuffles and changes. And I can tell you that the learning to close games out part of the maturation process is the most frustrating part of those ups and downs, where you're so close to getting it. I mean, it's kind of a little bit of what we went through in Colorado this week. I mentioned we have a lot of new guys on the team, being able to close out a good team, especially on the road after, missing on some games earlier too. It's hard. I think in 2017, the last year before we started making the playoffs again, I think we played in like 6 or 7 one-score games that year. It was something insane. And I think we only won one of them. And then we got to 2018, and all of a sudden we started winning those games. You have to kind of struggle through. And I think it's what we're seeing with Montreal. They have games in hand, but they're playing against good opponents. And the difference between a team that is winning and has experience, and I know Boston, it's like, well, do they really have experience? Well, they did make the playoffs last year. They did add some guys who definitely have experience. They're going to find ways to win that game. Whereas a team who's kind of going through that process, learning how to win those games, they are going to find ways to lose that game. And quite frankly, that's what happened to Montreal. They had an opportunity at the end of the fourth quarter, right outside of the end zone. Tried a little cheeky hammer over the top, it looked like, that didn't need to be tried. They still had 8 more seconds, and it just basically went straight into the ground. I think it got blocked by a Glory defender, but those are the things that happen when you're going through this process. They will learn from this. They will grow from this. And next year, I think they'll find themselves on the winning side of some of these games. But kudos to Boston for fighting back, because it really did kind of like the DC game in Montreal a couple weeks ago. It looked like Boston was kind of dead in the water and was going to lose their opportunity probably to host the playoffs. And now they're still right there. I mean, if they close out their last 2 games, the playoffs are going to run through Boston.
Couple of interesting notes about this game. You mentioned Montreal in close games this season. They have had 6 games decided by 2 goals or fewer. They have lost 5 of those. They're 1-5 in those matchups, to a point of a young team looking to get over the hump. Simon Carapella might be the best playing individual on the Boston roster right now. I'm not trying to say he's the most talented, most important, whatever. How he is playing right now is like the best Boston Glory player. He finishes with 8 scores, 34 from the field, and with 666 total yards. In addition to having 5 hockey assists, he was just a part of everything that Boston was doing well on offense. And then, most notably, and as a member of Evan Lepler's honor roll this week, reigning MVP Jeff Babbitt finishes with a game-high 31 total points played, 21 on offense, 10 on defense, finishes with 2 assists, 3 goals, 4 blocks, 21-21 from the field, 314 total yards without a turnover to speak of. To speak of a stat-stuffing a box score from, again, the league's best individual player. And this is one of those wins which I think gives a little bit more credence to Boston being a true contender. This is a game that they didn't necessarily deserve. I thought Montreal played better than them for a good 3/4 of this matchup. And yet the Glory just continue to gut out possessions. They take advantage of things when they can at the margins, and they turn it into a bit of that rock fight scenario that I love to bring up all the time, where it's like, show me what you have. And what Boston showed me in this is that they know how to gut out on the road a win that they shouldn't otherwise have, which to me is so indicative of when you kind of turn the corner on being a punchy team to something a little bit more legitimate, where you have these kind of scenarios where everything's working against you, the other team's making highlights, you go down early in overtime, and yet you come out the victor.
No, I agree. I mean, I can even think back to when the year we made the championship weekend in 2019, and I can think of the specific game for us that was that game. So I totally get what you're saying. Boston's scary, man. I mean, Jeff Babbitt's scary too. Gosh, stat line is just so stupid. I can't get it.
And also of note, he becomes the 7th player all time to reach 300 goal plateau. So absolute flowers deserved to him.
Yeah.
Welcome
to the club.
On me.
Welcome to the club, Jeff. It's nice here. Kick back. Teammate Rick Gross. Yeah,
that's Thompson coming from you. I'm sorry. You have over double that amount. So saying welcome to the club, it's like while your shoe prints are worn on all the cushions of the couch.
Okay. I mean, fair, but still.
There's Cam posters hanging up everywhere. There's your face in a glowing neon sign in the 300 and the 400 and the 500 and the 600 club, the last 3 of which you are the only members of.
Someone maybe someday, I don't know. You got to find somebody who's willing to attend pretty much every game, start playing as soon as they can, and just never retire. And there you go. That's the recipe. Got it. No, I mean, it's crazy also to me just that we're at 7 players, because it wasn't that long ago that the club at 300 was just me for a long time, actually. So the fact that we're up to 7 now, it's cool. My teammate Rick actually last year when I scored my 600th, that was the same day that Rick Gross scored his 300th. And I thought that was a cool moment. If I remember correctly, he threw me my 600th goal and I threw him his 300th goal. So it was kind of a nice little exchange with us.
It's
just crazy.
If Pavel Giannis is listening to this segment right now, he's probably
so
ripping out whatever remaining hair he has.
Yeah, he loves this.
Stats discussion. Stats.
Stats. And as a guy who has so many notable stats, that makes it even better, right? Like the only guy who's in the 4,000 and 5,000 completion, right? I'm sure he loves that.
Yeah. No, you guys are both distinguished in your individual accomplishments in ways I feel like you would both trade in a second for a little bit more team hardware. So,
Oh, 100%. I would give up every goal. I would, whatever to win a title. If we made it to, like, I think people assume because, you score a bunch of goals that that must be what you're thinking about all the time. And I mean, to an extent, I play on offense. So yes, I am thinking about scoring goals because that's good for us. But I mean, if we win, I don't care. I just want to win. I like winning. Winning's fun. It's way more fun than losing. I'm speaking to Dallas here. Trust me, it's more fun. Like, I know you haven't figured that out yet. But it's more fun.
just taking random shots.
Old man on the lawn, old man Cam was watching a Dallas game and saw somebody score and celebrate by throwing the disc 10 yards behind the goalpost. And all I could think is, if I was pulling on your team, I would punch you in the face for making me run 50 yards to pick that disc up before I could pull it. Come on, Dallas, do the little things well. Give your puller the disc so they don't have to do a wind sprint just to get to the pole on time, okay? Also, why are you celebrating down however many goals? Sorry.
Don't apologize. I'm a thorough hater, so like I can't stem on you just sharing some juice here.
Every once in a while I gotta let some of the venom out. I can't just store it up forever.
Apparently,
it's probably just left over from being mad about losing to Colorado, but
just a little bit.
Just
maybe a little bit.
I just gotta let some of it out. Okay, I have a question for you before I know we're getting to the end of it here, but is there any, which 3 seed, we have to leave the Central out of it because who knows who the 3 seed is, but which team that looks pretty much locked into the 3 seed? I think Oakland technically isn't locked into the 3 seed, but for all intents and purposes, they're probably the 3 seed. Which 3 seed do you trust less to put up a fight in the playoffs? Is it Austin or Oakland?
I think given the way that this season has gone, Austin a bit.
I agree.
100%. I haven't seen anything from them, but this is exactly how they were last year at this time. I mean, they had convincing losses against Atlanta and Carolina in 2023, and that didn't stop them from making championship weekend for the first time in their franchise's history. And Oakland is so high variance and emotional. It really depends on how they travel. The Spiders have not been a team that can take care of games on the road. That has been elucidated numerous times, most notably the past 2 seasons when they go on that LA, San Diego, SoCal road trip and just have been 0-4 in those games. So I feel like the Spiders have a lot of opportunity to prove themselves and show, even in a loss, a little bit more to their franchise on the road than they've been showing the past couple of seasons. But yeah, I feel like as much as I shade the Spiders there, I feel like it's Austin more so because of the quality of their opponents. Given the fact that Carolina and Atlanta can punch so high, I just worry about the Soul right now, given the relative variance that they show. Again, Houston was close and within striking distance throughout the first half of that game against them this past weekend. And so for the Soul to kind of get a little bit bogged down by an opponent like that, while facing a Carolina or Atlanta who still look like absolute championship contenders, I think it's just a daunting task for the Soul.
No, I agree. Oakland has a win over Seattle, and both of their games were a 1-point goal differential. So clearly they've shown they can punch with Seattle. They only had 1 game against Salt Lake. It was early in the season. Oakland, I think, lost by 5 or 6. So it wasn't particularly close. I'm kind of waiting to see what Salt Lake looks like going to the playoffs. But yeah, I think I 100% agree. Austin just looks so non-competitive. And I think the big difference between last year's run to championship weekend and a potential attempt at this, I guess not potential attempt, the attempt they'll have this year is this is a Carolina team that's bought in. Their roster is there. Like, yeah, they have some guys missing here and there, but it's not like last year where there was just such high variance in their roster and they didn't really look like the same Flyers team that we're used to seeing essentially since they came into the league. And Atlanta looks like the best team in the league right now. So like, while Atlanta definitely looked strong last year and was the 1 seed in their division, they did not look like they were the best team in the league as like they have for the last few weeks. So I think Austin looks objectively worse in their matchups against Carolina and Atlanta than last year. And also those teams look so much better than last year. It just looks like there's a wider gap for them to try to make up in the playoffs. And I don't want to say it can't happen because I think Austin proved last year that, they can punch up in big moments, but it's just been disappointing that they haven't been able to find ways to be competitive in those games throughout the regular season. Also, shout outs to Houston. First team completely done. Their 12 games are done. That snuck up on me that we have 2 weeks left in the season, but Houston is already done with their 12 games.
Shout out to Houston. They get 5 wins, all against Dallas. They clear their interstate schedule against the Legion in fantastic fashion. And I think that's just a mark on Bexforth, that coaching staff, the captainship of Ben Lewis and Matt Bennett and the rest of that core unit of the Havoc. They stay within playoff contention as long as Colorado. So if you were to tell me coming into the 2024 season that the Havoc and the Summit would have the same amount of potential playoff muster to their seasons, that would have been pretty shocking. And I think that's both a credit to the Havoc as well as a descriptor to where the Summit have placed this season.
Also, shout out to Ben Lewis, finishing with plus 54. I mean, he had 40 goals, heck of a season. I know you said he was one of the captains, put up some pretty good numbers this year. And I know 5 of those games were against Dallas. I get it. But, I
really wanted him to hit the 20-20-20 threshold. But
I know.
I teased a bit with Lucas Ambrose this season. I think Ambrose is still in line to hit that. He's currently at 13 assists, 16 goals, and 20 blocks with 2 games to play for Seattle. So I think that Ambrose has an opportunity to hit that. Lewis felt like he could have. Finishes with 24 assists, 40 goals, 15 blocks. Real ho-hum season from the Houston captain there.
Yeah. I mean, he came out the gate hot, right? That first week, he was like...
Oh, he was a monster. He was a monster all season long.
Yeah, he was like plus 14 or something stupid in their first game of the season.
He was plus 14. He had 4 assists, 9 goals, and 3 blocks in their opening weekend victory against Dallas.
But I think it does, and I don't want to spend too much. I know Houston's not a playoff team. They only beat Dallas. But, there's something to be said about, they were Dallas, if memory serves, was the better team in that matchup last year, taking more of, the wins. There is something to be said about, if you're not going to make the playoffs, take care of the teams at the bottom of your division and prove that you're the better team. Prove that while you're not a playoff team, that you maybe deserve to be thought of in a different light than the teams at the bottom of your division. And Houston did that, and to your point, they were competitive for parts of their Austin game. They weren't obviously very competitive with Atlanta and Carolina, but if I'm Houston going into the offseason thinking about next year, which their offseason has started at this point, I am looking at the success that we had against Dallas, that we dominated that matchup, and looking at what we did well in those Austin games that allowed us to stay in them before they got to the point where we just didn't have anymore, right? So I think there's a lot of positive things that can come out of the season, even though they did only beat one opponent. There's things to build on there. So, them being one of the newer franchises, I think that they should kind of go into the offseason with some momentum thinking about those things. And I'll be interested to see if they can kind of, they took a big step forward this year dominating that matchup. I will be interested. Can they take another step forward going into, I mean, that's obviously a conversation for down the road, but it's something that I know I'm already going to be thinking about when we kind of see what player movement and stuff looks like in the offseason.
You know what I'm looking forward to? These next 2 weekends of matches.
I was about to say.
Absolutely, man. I mean, in week 12, we've got Chicago at Madison and New York and Minnesota on Friday night. We've got Indianapolis and Pittsburgh on Sunday. And then the final weekend of the regular season is really like the first weekend of the playoffs because of how vital each of the games will be for potential playoff teams. I mean, you guys in Indy are squaring off in Madison. That will figure to either decide a playoff spot, if not be do or die for both teams. You've got Seattle at Salt Lake, which will determine the 1 seed in the West Division. You've got Carolina at Atlanta, also determining the 1 seed in the South, as well as DC and New York in their second meeting of the season. Basically the most scintillating rivalry that we have within the entire league. They will also meet on July 20th. Again, that final weekend will decide potentially 3 of the 4 first seeds within divisions in the UFA. Cannot wait. And again, we have 10 of the 12 playoff teams confirmed, but that is about as much as we know heading into these last 2 weekends of the UFA 2024 regular season. That will do it for this Week 11 recap episode of Swing Pass. Cam and I will be back with you in just a couple of days to preview again a real scintillating end of the season stretch within the association. That'll do it for us for now. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Oh, he's getting the crowd going.
Are you kidding me? You are kidding me! Holy smokes! Was there any doubt? Was there any doubt? This is going to be the game. Joel Clutton battling for position. He tips it to the end zone where it's caught by Elijah Jaime.